Welcome to the ISF podcast from the Information Security Forum. The ISF podcast is hosted by ISF CEO Steve Durbin, and every episode he brings listeners features timely conversations, practical insights, and resources for global cybersecurity professionals. I'm producer Tavia Gilbert. Steve, October is Cybersecurity Awareness Month, which has been adopted globally, I understand, to help individuals and businesses protect themselves from online threats to technology and to confidential data. And this is really important because, Steve, I understand that ransomware attacks grew 450% just last year. And when hit with a data breach, the average cost is nearly $4.5 million. Where organizations have rehearsed incident response plans, they were able to save on average $2.6 million when compared with those who hadn't rehearsed. So every organization needs to be well-resourced to prevent an attack. And they need to understand how to make themselves a less attractive target. So let's talk about that. I'm curious, how does an organization make themselves less attractive to these bad cyber actors?
Yeah, it is a good question, Tavia, and it's one that I've talked about for quite some while now. And I always use that sort of analogy of, if you go into a bar and there's somebody there who's probably had a drink or two too many down one end, and you probably want to stay away from that. I'm not suggesting that organizations suddenly take to drink, although some of them that have been caught up in ransomware attacks probably have done so.
That's very fair.
But it is about making yourself look unattractive. So what does that mean? Well, it means that you do the basics. So it is about patching. It is about making sure that you're not making life easy for a cyber criminal. What you really want to try to do is to get them to move on down the line. You want them to move to the next organization away from yours. So anything that you can do by, increasing the difficulty of accessing some of your internal information. You'll be looking at your people. You'll be looking at the way in which you're monitoring your networks. You'll be looking at whether or not you've got the most up-to-date policy so that people know how to respond and so on to different activities. And you'll probably be having a fairly well-developed and active situational awareness program where you are sharing information on an ongoing basis, either with peer group organizations or indeed with the authorities. If you're in the United States, the FBI has a good program. If you're in the United Kingdom, for instance, NCSC is very good at that sort of thing as well. And there are other organizations all around the world that people will be familiar with as they listen to this. So it is about just making sure that if somebody is going to break into your organization, they're not going to have an easy time of it.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I'm wondering if you have a sense of how pervasive the rehearsal is in enterprises. Do you see that enterprises are going through those incidents response plans, rehearsing them appropriately? Are they doing tabletop exercises enough? Is there always room for improvement? We've been at this for several years, and I wonder if that time you've seen more enterprises adopting this approach.
Yeah, there is always, room for improvement. I don't think that anybody would claim to have the absolute answer to this, but specifically around those incident response programs and practicing them, for me, that's essential. What you're trying to do is build in corporate muscle memory so that come the day when something does go wrong, you don't have to necessarily, head for the manual to figure out what you need to do next. And for a lot of organizations, of course, this is not that different from what they're used to doing when it comes to business continuity planning, because this is just BCP by another name. Mm-hmm. The ISF, we probably run these now for external audiences at the rate of, at least a couple every month in different locations all around the world. And that really is there to try to support what an organization might be doing itself, but perhaps more importantly, provide them with an opportunity to share insights, gain valuable feedback from peer groups, because we don't have just one organization in that. We mix up the different organizations that come along. And that, for me, is where a lot of the value comes from. Because you may have your own very well-rehearsed plan, but again, you can always learn from somebody else. So somebody else in your industry sector may be doing something you hadn't thought of, may have tried something that you'd like to try as well. So that's the sort of feedback that we get from attendees at those events, that there is great value in having a mixture of organizations come along. And as I say, we facilitate those on a regular basis, at least a couple every month all around the world. And I think we've just finished doing one in Canada this week, and we did one in the UK last week. So, they are, as I said, being run all around the world.
I have a funny question. There's a difference between thinking you're rehearsing and rehearsing. And I'm thinking this because my dad had his first debate last night for his political campaign. And he was thinking he was rehearsing when he was thinking about the material, reading it, preparing it. But the act of getting on your feet and actually saying the words out loud, making a physical connection so that your rehearsal moves from your mind into reality, is that something that is relevant to rehearsals where you're actually literally going through exercises and directing people and responding in a more active way than just the thought and the sort of intellectual study of the rehearsal? Is that a place that enterprises can improve their rehearsals for cybersecurity attacks?
I think it is. And I think that you make a very valid point. You use the word exercise quite a lot there. I'm not a fan of cyber exercises per se, because that traditionally to people means, okay, we've got the manual, let's work through its classroom.
Right.
Okay. Now, the real world is never classroom. And so certainly when we run these incident response, BCP planning type events, what we try to do is make the attendees uncomfortable. So we do put them into certain scenarios. We do throw things at them that are not expected. So they're having to think on their feet. And it isn't so much about following a manual through. It's about how are you working through a particular set of problems which are constantly changing. So it is what we try to do is to, within obviously an accelerated time frame, raise the stress levels so that people come out of that really having been tested. And indeed, of course, there is never a right answer. That's the other really important thing I think that perhaps some organizations forget. Every situation that you come up against is probably going to be unlike what you've rehearsed.
Right.
But the basic process, the basic way that you respond, the people that you call in, the way in which you handle it will remain the same. And those are the sorts of things that you need to be rehearsing. So I think it is very useful to have an external party run you through that kind of incident response on a regular basis. I think it is very useful to have the whole variety across your organization involved. So we're doing some very large pieces of work at the moment that involves everybody from the chairman down. Because, of course, if you think about a serious incident, you mentioned ransomware there, it is going to be certain board members that have to step up. It is going to be the chief executive. It could be the chairman, certainly addressing shareholders and that kind of thing. So you want to have been rehearsing the way that these individuals go about delivering the messages, the manner in which they do that, and giving them confidence. Because until you actually do that, it all just exists on paper and it's all a manual and it isn't real. So I think a couple of messages I would suggest in that for organizations thinking about these incident response programs: do get high-level engagement, do make it as real as possible. I would suggest using a third party to run it, because then you don't control it as much.
Right.
And do try to accelerate the time frame, because that will raise the stress level. And yes, it's a little bit artificial, but there's value to be gained from that kind of thing.
You're also talking about the entirety of the organization. So this cannot be an exercise that is just within the cybersecurity team. If it's going to be really robust and really beneficial, you have to involve all the way up through the board. Do you think boards are prepared for that kind of involvement?
Certainly more advanced boards are, and they're asking that sort of question. How do they get involved? The answer may be, of course, they don't get involved. The answer may be, and it's a perfectly valid one, do nothing. Because the last thing you want is, open season in the boardroom where every board member thinks he or she has got a right to go and give their sixpenneth worth to the press about what's happening. So the message may be do nothing and wait for instruction. That's absolutely fine. But you will have nominated key individuals that will be talking to the outside world, that will be managing what's going on inside. And your cyber team is going to have a key role in that, because they are going to be providing the insight and the guidance that a business leader simply won't have. The business leader will be worried about the fact that perhaps a network is down, they can't deliver product, they can't deliver services, but they wouldn't necessarily know how to go about fixing that problem. And that's where the security team really begins to come into its own.
I think that's a good segue to how to empower your employees to keep your organization secure, because we're talking about human psychology, which we come back to again and again. So that leadership component of how do you engage the board, maybe it's deeply engaged, maybe it's hold on, we'll have further instructions later, but it is that leadership and that psychology piece. How do you get that delivered to employees to help enhance security in an organization?
Yeah, it's a tough one. And, it's one I think that organizations, security departments have grappled with for some years. I think in the material that we put out for Cyber Awareness Month, we do use this stat that in 2021, over 90% of security incidents were caused by human error, accidents, or negligent behavior. And there's no silver bullet to fixing that. I think that there is clearly opportunity within organizations to increase the amount of awareness training. Some people will probably groan at that. But the reality is that you need to make it applicable to the individual. You need individuals to really understand the role that they play in becoming the strongest link in the security chain, as opposed to what, if you look at it statistically, would seem to indicate that they're the weakest. So what are things that they should be doing that relate to themselves, to their jobs, that they can easily remember, rehearse? And what I've always found is that if you can make it personal, then you're on to something. So it isn't about policies and processes and hammering home the need for that. You have to look at it from the individual standpoint. I've been working 8 hours, 9 hours, whatever it might be. I'm tired. I'm just about to log off and something comes in. Well, how do you cater for that moment? What are you going to do in that? If something looks a little bit fishy, it probably is. Well, does everybody know what to do with an email that looks a little bit suspect? Have you actually told them who to send it to, who to ask? How do you deal with out of hours? Those are the sorts of things that are important when we talk about trying to eliminate human error and trying to empower employees. So it's making it very real. It's making it something that people can relate to. I think, on previous podcasts, you and I have talked about trying to come up with scenarios that people can relate to in the home. Everybody's concerned if they've got children about them not accessing the wrong kinds of sites. Grooming, that kind of thing is very real, unfortunately. So these are the sorts of things that people will pay attention to. And so it's about using some of those real life at-home type environmental issues to accentuate some of the points I think that you want to make from an organizational point of view. And of course, with the way in which we now work today, a lot of people working from home anyway as the way that they now work, we have to take those things into account, whether we like it or not, because the days of being able to control an organizational in-house environment are very much long gone, and I don't see them returning, to be quite honest.
You tell me if this is making too big of a leap, but over the last few years, we've talked about things like mental health, self-care, and if you're going to engage your employees in supporting your security practices and you are going to make it personal, you actually have to care that they may be tired after 8 or 9 hours. You have to care about their home working environment. You have to be aware of those human elements, that you can't look at your employees, whether it's 10 or 150,000, as just cogs in the wheel that are sort of machine-like, that you tell them what to do and they do it. You have to actually think you're dealing with human beings. What are their real circumstances? Is that a good point to make for enhancing security? Boundaries, having time off, having end of a workday that's a real end, all of those things will enhance security? Or is that a silly connection to make?
No, I don't think it is. I don't think it's silly at all. I think that it's the reality. If you're trying to get messages across, it's very helpful to understand the psychology of the people that you're trying to influence. It's very important to understand their environment in which they're operating. You make a point of people clocking off at a certain time. Now, depending on which particular press you like to read, home working has had a pretty bad rep in certain areas simply because there's this assumption that people are not putting in the hours. Nothing could be further from the truth in my experience. In fact, quite the opposite is the case. People are working longer hours. And so that does add to things like cyber fatigue. It does add to mental health issues. And of course, because you aren't in an office environment, there isn't that sort of feeling of, oh, okay, everybody's leaving to go home now, or there's a shift change or whatever it might be, because you're at home and it's your environment. And so if you choose just to look at another email, you'll do it before doing something else. And before you know, you've got caught up in it and time has gone by. So I do think that from a people management point of view, there is an absolute need for us to look again at the way in which we manage our people, at the structures that we have in place, because the traditional may not be valid any longer. And we are seeing it tends to be particularly smaller organizations, but some large ones are also trying different things, where they are, limiting hours that people work, where they are perhaps reducing the working week, where the expectation is being managed a little better. But we're a long, long way, I think, from getting this right. And it takes us off into another particular area, potentially anyway, around, technology addiction, because it isn't just the employer that is causing some of this stress. It's the employee as well. And again, we've talked on previous podcasts about the challenge of technology, about trying to switch off from it.
Right.
And so, we need to understand the fact that a lot of people are addicted to technology. And so what is it that we can do to help break some of that down? You start to get into a very sort of broad-ranging discussion when you start to look at it from that perspective.
Right.
And it's probably something that, again, we'll come back to in future podcasts, because I don't think it's a problem that we've managed to deal with effectively. And of course, there has now been a lot more research done in that space too. But it's very, very important when we talk about, a Cyber Awareness Month, for us to be aware of all of the different components that we need to be considering, not just perhaps some of the traditional ones that we've just touched on.
So organizations really, really need to be proactive in their approach to security, and they need to intentionally build positive behaviors within their staff as early on as possible. Is that right?
I think that's right. And I think it is about, providing very clear guidelines. It's about providing very clear approaches, maybe tools to help people, as you say, be proactive in their approach to security. And it's also about supporting that with additional skills-based training for information security and risk teams. But I actually wouldn't stop there. I think it's also about taking it out into the lines of business. And when I talk to some really interesting organizations about the way that they are dealing with these sorts of issues, it has been about moving security much, much closer into the business. So reducing the size of security departments, having people with security responsibilities that are working in lines of business, because then they're able to see exactly how people operate with the tools that they've got. They're able to see some of the challenges that are being faced firsthand and can provide a lot more in-the-moment support, which is actually the important piece. It's absolutely no point if I've opened a phishing email sending me on a course 2 weeks later. Absolutely no point at all. I'll fly through the course. I'll come off with, having ticked all the right boxes, but I won't have made the link between opening a phishing email on my machine and the course that I've just been on. And so if you're going to provide that sort of training, it's about providing feedback in the moment.
Yeah.
And we've seen some very great improvements, I think, in technology and the ways that you can do that, so that actually when organizations are doing things like running phishing tests and so on, employees are being given in the moment feedback, because that helps with the learning process.
You said something interesting that I want to clarify. Making the security team smaller and moving it closer to the business. And I'm wondering, are you implying that positions within businesses are becoming hybrid? So that you're not just in sales, you're in sales and security. You're not just in human resources, you're in human resources and security. Is that the sort of closer to the business, integrated into the business mindset that business leaders are looking at?
I think there is a shift that's going on. I think that there is a general level now of understanding that if anything that you do involves technology, that security has to be a part of that. And that can be at a very simple level, password protecting a device, for instance, being aware that if you're on public transport, perhaps that's not the best place to be looking at corporate information, although we know people still do it, of course. So demystifying some of the security elements, making it closer to what I do on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think, if we look forward, that we will get to a point, not where the security team is redundant, I don't see that, but I do see that the end user has become much more educated in how to remain secure when operating the technology that they've been given.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, historically, we've made an assumption that everybody can use a smartphone, everybody can use a laptop. Well, yes, of course, a lot of people can. But can they do it securely? Do they understand why they have to do certain things? Do they understand why they have to log in and perhaps have multi-factor authentication? What's the business benefit of that?
Mm-hmm.
So it's about talking about security in a language that the business understands so that you are going through some form of skills transfer. And the best way of enabling that is by having people with a security background, perhaps, in the business and vice versa, so that you've got that real exchange, if you like, of information, which is so important if you're going to come up with the right policies and the processes and the ways to actually reduce your risk at an organization level and also better empower your individuals to understand when they need to shout for help and who they can call.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about some security steps that I find people continue to resist because they are a little bit slower, like that third-party authentication. It's a little bit slower. There's an extra step. Can you prioritize security and maintain your competitiveness? Can you prioritize security and still be at speed? Is it one or the other? Can they coexist happily?
I think that if I look at organizations that I've worked with or come into contact with, say over the last 12 to 18 months, then the ones that have preserved that agility that you're talking about have been those that have looked to build security into their processes by design from the outset. And the ones that have struggled have been those that have tried to retrofit security. So we've been doing this and now we've hit a problem, so let's try to put a security process wrapper around it to solve that particular problem. So the answer to your question, can you have good security and can you have agility in the business? Of course you can. But it won't happen unless you plan for it. And it won't happen miraculously overnight. You are going to have to design it in. And that means that you have to really come at it from the perspective of your basic business processes. And if you're a very large organization, of course, and you haven't taken that step, that's difficult to do because you're now talking about a big transformation program. If you're smaller, if you're a startup, that kind of thing, then it's much easier because you can build it in from the outset. But it is possible to do. And I think that certainly we're seeing forward-looking organizations really adopt that kind of approach, and it is reaping benefit. It isn't just, if I loop back to what you said some moments ago about the cost of a ransomware or cost of a data breach, it isn't about the financial cost. People get very excited about the millions of dollars or the millions of pounds or euros or whatever it is that it's costing. That's not the real cost at all.
Right.
The real cost for breach is the fact that your business cannot function, that you're losing market share, that your shareholders are upset and angry with you. And those are the realities, that you've lost your competitive advantage, that your brand has been damaged. Those are the very real costs. Those are the sorts of things that, in my experience, boards tend to get excited about, not 4 million or 5 million or whatever the number might be. That's an inconvenience.
Right.
Now, there may be some people listening to this who say he doesn't know what he's talking about. That's a big number. But if you actually tot up the impact of those other things that I was talking about, that has a far bigger negative impact on your business and your ability to transact business going forward than having to simply pay for a data breach along the lines of the numbers we've been talking about.
Right, right. Well, the ISF is responding to the needs to increase cybersecurity awareness by delivering 5 days of thought-provoking webinars during Cybersecurity Showcase Week. And this is an opportunity for ISF analysts and organizations to discuss a whole range of topics, including the modern approach to fight phishing, techniques used to counter supply chain attacks, why cyber is for everyone, and more. Can you tell me more about this programming, what you have planned? and maybe touch on the ransomware resource kit I know you have developed.
Sure. As you rightly say, we've got this Cybersecurity Showcase Week that's actually running from the 17th to the 21st of October. And that's a series of webinars and podcasts and so on around specific themes on each of those days. But that's just 1 week out of the whole Cyber Awareness Month. And if people want to go to our website, then they can download a resource kit that looks at how to deal with, you mentioned ransomware, but other events as well that take place. There's information in there about threats that people perhaps might want to think about, threat intelligence, some analyst insights as well that we've got going on about how to deal with particular threats and the impact that they might have on an organization, some of which along the lines that we've just been talking about. So there's a fairly comprehensive set of resources that we are putting out there for Cyber Awareness Month. And as I say, it's available not just to members of the ISF, but also to non-members. And if they go along to our website, securityforum.org, then they can download that and use a lot of those materials within their own organizations. So we're not requiring anybody to pay any royalty fees and all of that kind of stuff. It's all freely available for people to download and use.
Great. Well, we'll put a link to those resources in the show notes. And I really appreciate your time today. This has been, as always, illuminating. So we'll be back for more Cybersecurity Awareness Month conversation in the weeks to come.
Thanks very much, Tavia.
We'll be back next week with a new episode. In the meantime, as always, we ask that you take 5 seconds to pull up this podcast on whatever device you're listening and give us a 5-star rating. And if you have time, write a short review. That helps other listeners who might enjoy our content find us. And if there's a topic or question that you'd like us to cover in a future episode, let us know at securityforum.org, which is also where you can find our catalog of past video and podcast episodes, as well as ISF's research, practical tools, and guidance related to discussions like today's. We also want to introduce you to the ISF Analyst Insight podcast, which goes in-depth on the hottest topics in information security. In every episode, ISF analysts hand-select active security professionals from ISF member organizations to discuss how the implementation of ISF research is uniquely applied to their real-world context. And of course, we'll put a link to the ISF Analyst Insight podcast in the show notes. The ISF podcast is produced by TalkBox and Tavia Gilbert, with music by Alexander Filipiak. Senior producer Katie Flood. Mix and master by Kayla Elrod. Thanks for listening.